Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I will be ranking all 14 Agatha Christie short stories featuring the mysterious Mr. Harley Quinn and his partner of sorts, Mr. Satterthwaite. And most of these stories were collected in the mysterious Mr. Quinn collection, and I will not be spoiling anything about these short stories, including the big secret. If you know, you know. But a little bit on Harley Quinn, who I always liked. He's an enigmatic figure who appears in places of strife and disappears when the strife is eliminated. He dresses very elaborately in bright colors. Mr. Satterthwaite debuted with Mr. Quinn, but is probably best known for his appearance in Three Act Tragedy, where I think most people are introduced to him. He's elderly-ish and a bit of a snob. He likes wealthy, interesting people, especially duchesses. He's a bit lonely and an observer of life, not a participant, as that gets mentioned a lot. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Starting out at the bottom is, and I should say, I don't think any of these short stories are bad. I mean, some are much better than others, but none are really bad. But at number 14, I have The Soul of the Croupier. Mr. Satterthwaite is in Monte Carlo, where he once again comes across Mr. Quinn, and I have this one last simply because I just didn't find it as interesting or complex a story as the others. It does the same things the other stories do in that, Mr. Quinn helps Mr. Satterthwaite solve someone's despair. I just did not find the story of the man and his former lover who betrayed him that interesting, but the setting is nice. I felt like I was in Monte Carlo, and it wasn't a bad story. There's a good scene where, like, the croupier, Mr. Satterthwaite, actually wins on the roulette wheel, but the croupier awards it to someone else, and Mr. Satterthwaite just lets it go. But I kind of knew where the story was heading the entire time. I didn't find the characters that interesting. It was fine. There's nothing really against it, but it's not spectacular, so it's here at number 14. At number 13, I have the final Mr. Quinn short story written, The Harlequin Tea Set. And Christie wrote all of these stories in the 1920s, and they were collected in 1930. This is one of the two not to be collected, and the only one written in the 1970s. She did not write this story until like 30 to 40 years after the others, and you could sort of feel it. It's not as clean and sharp as her works were in the 1920s, but the Harlequin Tea Set isn't as loose or sloppy or incoherent as her other works from that time. This might actually be the best thing Christie wrote in the 1970s. And there are some moments where you can tell, but it's not overall an issue. And I find the mystery here to be pretty good. I mean, most of these stories do involve a murder or a death, and this one is an attempted murder. Mr. Satterthwaite had not seen Mr. Quinn in a very long time, and he was wondering about him, and then he comes across a Harlequin Tea Set in a shop window, which he took as a sign of Mr. Quinn was coming, and he does. And the tea set is purchased by the daughter-in-law of a friend of Mr. Satterthwaite, so he visits, and that's when he gets caught up in the attempted murder mystery there. As much as I like this mystery, I do think it's pretty obvious as well, and it also relies on color blindness and some like weird switcheroos and identities that aren't entirely plausible. It's a fun story. I think it's much more fun than the Soul of the Croupier. This is a decent one, but it has some issues, so it's here at number 13. At number 12 is a short story that I always think of when I think of Mr. Quinn, but on a reread, it just lacked for me, and that is At the Bells and Mly. Mr. Satterthwaite has car trouble, as one is wont to do in a Mr. Quinn short story. This happens a lot, and he finds Mr. Quinn staying at the inn called the Bells and Mly. They discuss the disappearance of a man who was recently married and lived nearby in the area. And as much as I find this story entertaining, it's almost entirely told to us in this discussion between Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite. There's not much action in this story, and for me, that knocks it down a bit because we aren't experiencing it firsthand. I think the story's solution has some issues and flaws in credibility as well, but on the flip side, I think of At the Bells and Mly as sort of like classic Mr. Quinn. It's a fun story, don't get me wrong, but it lacks a bit in the development and the action. But I do find the Mr. Quinn content be really good. At the Bells and Mly, it just sounds like Mr. Quinn is going to be there, and of course he is. But it's story lacks a little bit. Could have used a little more excitement here and there, so I have it here at number 12. At number 11, the other short story not included in the Mysterious Mr. Quinn collection, The Love Detectives. And my main issue with The Love Detectives isn't the quality of the story. Unfortunately for it, it suffers from an unfair comparison to Murder at the Vicarage, which Christie wrote while expanding upon this short story. Murder at the Vicarage is fantastic, and it's unfortunate that this story just doesn't stand up in comparison. And I want to be fair to The Love Detectives. I don't mean to suggest this is a bad story. It starts off good, but all the, interesting bits of the solution are just kind of told to us. We don't experience it. And while that is the nature of many short stories, it did leave me wanting more, and wanting more of interest. I didn't feel as if this murder was solvable because there was information we just couldn't have known. And obviously, Chrissy does this same story much better in Murder at the Vicarage, where she has, more room to plant clues and present information and get into character development. The Love Detectives does have a good story to it, and the Quinn and Satterthwaite content is strong. And I enjoy the story, but again, it does suffer from being just outshined by a very similar work. And the other stories in this collection are more original, so I put it here at number 11. At number 10, we have another story with Mr. Satterthwaite abroad with a Duchess friend, and that is The World's End. And for me, this is where we start getting to some of the more superior stories. Mr. Satterthwaite is in Corsica, where he meets up with one of his Duchess friends whose poor younger cousin is an artist. The Duchess makes fun of this artist, but Mr. Satterthwaite purchases one of her drawings, and they go on a picnic together to a place called The World's End because it looks over the sea as if that's the end of the world, that there's nothing beyond it. And Mr. Quinn suddenly shows up in this pretty remote place, which is extremely typical for him, and Mr. Satterthwaite is confused because he didn't really get the sense there was a problem that needed to be solving, at least a problem along the lines of what Mr. Quinn does. The World's End is the first story on this list that I felt was both fully developed and fleshed out, as well as entertaining. However, I do think this one took a long time to sort of get to the central plot and premise. And overall, while I did enjoy the story, I didn't feel as if it was impactful as the remaining stories are. But we did get a lot of good Quinn and Satterthwaite content, with Mr. Quinn making one of his more dramatic exits in the end of this story, which really says something. It's a good story. I mean, not top tier, so I have it at number 10. At number 9, we have a short story that I really enjoy but has some issues, and that is The Voice in the Dark. Mr. Satterthwaite is with yet another Duchess friend, and this one is concerned about her daughter, who is allegedly being haunted by a ghost, despite their family home not being haunted. And she heard the titular voice in the dark and something about returning what was owed. And I really enjoy this story. It's cleverly clued, the characters are a lot of fun, but I have two big knocks against it. One is that Mr. Quinn is barely in this story. He does appear, but doesn't have a role in the resolution, and this story is more about Mr. Satterthwaite sort of coming into his own in regards to helping other people with their problems. So Mr. Quinn takes a bit of a backseat here, although he is an influence on Mr. Satterthwaite. And I would have loved to have seen Mr. Quinn deal with the medium who shows up at the end. My other and more important issue is that the solution to what's going on here is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, this is one of the most unbelievable solutions to any Mr. Quinn story. It's not credible at all. I won't spoil it for you if you haven't read it, but there's just no way this would have happened in real life. This is probably up there with Murder in Mesopotamia in terms of just how unlikely the solution is. But like I said, the story has a lot going for it. It's well clued, and you probably won't figure out the solution. And it's also fun, but it's almost too ridiculous where I do have to knock it for credibility. And as much as I love The Voice in the Dark, I just couldn't put it any higher than here at number 9. At number 8 is the very first Quinn and Satterthwaite story, The Coming of Mr. Quinn. And this one does have some things in common with past stories, at the Bells and Mly, and that the mystery is told to us in story form rather than something we experience firsthand. However, despite that, I think this is the superior title. We are introduced to both Satterthwaite and Quinn, with Mr. Quinn having car trouble this time, not Mr. Satterthwaite. And I think the story perfectly encapsulates the best of Harley Quinn. A group of people at a New Year's party are discussing the past death of a friend who 10 years prior committed suicide, apparently for no reason. And Mr. Quinn comes in and doesn't necessarily solve the issue, but prompts Mr. Satterthwaite to solve it. Mr. Satterthwaite is an observer of life and people, and it's Mr. Quinn who encourages him to solve the issues at hand. Because this is the first time we see both of them, I think this is the ideal to have a rather simple mystery to show off who they are and what they can do. Mr. Quinn swoops in out of nowhere, aids in the solving of a mystery, and helps resolve it so those involved can move on with their lives. It is usually a pair of lovers who need help, or more accurately, usually just like one lover in the pair needs help. It's actually very Miss Silver like, but again, much better. I don't have any issues with the mystery itself. It is a little basic, but it's still a good one and works perfectly for the introduction. So I have The Coming of Mr. Quinn here at number 8. At number 7, we just had the first Quinn story, and now we have the final Quinn story, at least from the Mysterious Mr. Quinn collection, and that is Harlequin's Lane. And I'm going to be honest, I wanted to put this one a lot lower, but I didn't for a few reasons. One is that it is beautifully written. This is some of Christie's best writing from the 1920s. The second is that this is a very important one. It is the final story for decades, and it's the one where we learn more about Mr. Quinn and who he is. I'm not going to spoil the big reveal, but if you know, you know. I would recommend reading this one last or second to last before the Harlequin Tea Set. There are a lot of allegorical references made. There's a lot of good emotional work Christie does here. She's very good at evoking the feelings of her characters within the reader. And the plot centers around a production of the Harlequinade, in which Mr. Quinn has to fill in as you guessed it, the Harlequin. And at the end, Mr. Quinn reveals his true self, which is a nice moment. And when I think readers saw coming possibly, I remember the first time I read these stories, I did have like an inkling of the truth and more accurately, like suspicions. But for me, however, this story is just not the type of story I enjoy reading. It borderline gets into like the romantic. And I know I don't need everything to be a mystery. I enjoy literature that's not, but I'm not a one-trick pony, but this just like isn't the type of story I like. But I recognize how beautifully it is written and how good it is and how important it is. It's just not my favorite, so I have Harlequin's Lane here at number 7. At number 6, and this is where I think we could get into high gear. These are all fantastic stories in my opinion. It's just a matter of ordering them. And at number 6, I have The Face of Helen. Mr. Satterthwaite this time runs into his friend Harley Quinn at a production of Pagliacci because, that's appropriate. And afterward, Mr. Satterthwaite rescues a young woman from a fight between her two suitors. And we have a love triangle in this one, and it's a pretty good one. I can't talk about the mystery too much without spoiling anything, but it's very good. I think the operatic setting is not only well executed for thematic and atmospheric purposes, but also the mystery itself feels very operatic. It's the perfect plot for this theme. And I really enjoy the story of Mr. Satterthwaite helping the young heroine decide on which suitor to select and also solving the mystery here. And the mystery is one you don't necessarily notice is there because not all of these Quinn stories are mysteries. It's easy to fall into the trap that this isn't one. And we have a lot of good Quinn and Satterthwaite content. Christie goes very hard on the Harlequinade theme stuff in this one, but in a very restrained way that you're not rolling your eyes. This is a very solid story, but I just prefer the other 5, so The Face of Helen comes in here at number 6. At number 5 is the second short story in the collection, The Shadow on the Glass. And this is a very strong short story, and one that is very hectic and full of characters. There are a lot of characters in this one, and they are all developed and play a key role in the story. Very often, neither of those things are the case, even in some novels, so Christie expertly executes it here. This story features another duchess who lives in a haunted house, in which a face appears on a pane of glass, and it reappears even if the window is replaced. There's a house party, and 2 guests are shot dead in a very dramatic fashion. Mr. Satterthwaite was already there, but what do you know? Mr. Quinn randomly shows up to buy a painting not 2 minutes after the murder happens, and Christie packs so much mystery and character work into about 20 pages, which is just remarkable. One of my favorite things about this story, and it's something Christie always does very well, is her use of the supernatural. Not the supernatural itself, which she finds bunkum, but Christie always accounts for other people's beliefs in the supernatural. The supernatural is not real, but that doesn't mean people don't believe in it. And Christie has such a way of using that belief to her benefit and to the murderer's benefit. The Shadow in the Glass, fantastic story, so it's here at number 5. At number 4, a story with a very creative murder, and that is The Bird with the Broken Wing. Mr. Satterthwaite travels to a house called Lydell for the sole reason that a Ouija board told him Mr. Quinn would be there. And Mr. Quinn is not there, but who is there is a young woman named Mabel, who apparently met Mr. Quinn strolling in the woods, which sounds about right. And Mr. Satterthwaite dubs Mabel the bird with the broken wing, but unfortunately, she's murdered that night. And this is such a strong story with a very unique murder weapon. We have a lot of suspects. I feel similarly about this one how I do about The Shadow on the Glass, but I feel like this one is a little more refined, a little more elegantly written. There's this is another where Mr. Quinn doesn't appear a lot, but I felt this one does a better job of depicting Mr. Satterthwaite's growth and handling this problem by himself. He actually thinks he failed because he thought he was supposed to save Mabel, but Mr. Quinn explains he was supposed to save the innocent from being wrongly accused, which was a nice twist. I also really like the murderer in the story, one of my favorite killers in a Christie short story. Lots of irony and the unexpected here. I just love this story, so I have it at number 4. At number 3, and we're in the thick of the cream of the crop here with The Sign in the Sky. And this is another very full murder mystery. Mr. Satterthwaite meets Mr. Quinn at the Arlecchino restaurant because Christie never misses a chance to insert the Harlequin theme into these stories. And they discuss the recent conviction of a man for murder, but there's something like not quite settled about it in Mr. Satterthwaite's mind, which leads into a very strong mystery plot. And Christie later reused some of the parts of this mystery in Taken at the Flood, although this story is completely different from that novel. It just takes certain elements of it. And I love this story, and it's another example of Christie pulling off a very good mystery in very little space. There are a lot of great clues. I will say The Sign in the Sky probably has a bigger knock against it than the last few I talked about. There's a weird sequence at the end where Mr. Satterthwaite travels by boat far into Canada and returns to England in basically no time. It's a large plot hole here. The amount of time it takes Mr. Satterthwaite to travel is way too long to save the man from being hanged. It's quite noticeable. And it's also referenced in the book that there's very little time, so I think it is a pretty big knock here. But for me, it doesn't really detract from the rest of the story, which I find very strong. So I have The Sign in the Sky here at number 3. And at number 2 is actually the story I thought I would have at number 1 because I simply forgot about the number 1, but I placed this one here and I have The Dead Harlequin. And Mr. Satterthwaite purchases a painting from an up-and-coming artist that depicts a man in a window looking in on what appears to be his dead body. The man looks just like Mr. Quinn, who suddenly turns up one evening during a little house party at Charnley, which is the house depicted in the painting. The house is haunted, like all good English country houses. More than one person shows up wanting to buy this painting from Mr. Satterthwaite, and the painting holds major clues about the murder depicted in it. And I love this mystery. I know I said that a lot in this video, but these murders are pretty good, and this is another fine example of Christie using the supernatural to her advantage. Mr. Quinn content is also very good. This is like peak Mr. Quinn, with him appearing and disappearing suddenly, and this is really the only one where he's like an active participant in the actual mystery plot and not just like an observer or someone like solving the issue. He's a witness, and I think this story really shows off Mr. Quinn's power and what he can do in a very subtle manner. And this is just an all-around great short story, so I put The Dead Harlequin here at number 2. And at number 1 is a short story often in the running for Christie's greatest short story, and while I wouldn't necessarily go that far, I would say it is the best Mr. Quinn, and that is The Man from the Sea. And this is not a mystery short story, but a very emotional one, and it's hard to discuss without spoiling it too much, but I'll try. Mr. Satterthwaite is vacationing on a Spanish island when he comes across two separate individuals who are sort of lovelorn, with the man saying he's dying in 6 months and intends to kill himself by jumping off a cliff into the water where another man once drowned. And then he meets a single mother whose husband treated her poorly, but now she misses another lover she had. And The Man from the Sea is a highly emotionally charged short story, and it is beautifully written. It's almost a little bit of a Mary Westmacott feel to it. And if you've read the Mary Westmacotts, you know that they aren't really romances as people say they are, but more of Christie writing like an unrestrained in in a format where she can write what she wants without having to worry about like Poirot or plotting mysteries. I think it's safe to say that Mary Westmacotts and The Man from the Sea are Christie writing from a more personal perspective than her traditional mysteries. The Man from the Sea is just beautifully written and executed. You feel the emotions of these characters and the turmoil of Mr. Satterthwaite as he struggles to help these people, and Mr. Quinn coming off as extremely mysterious here. I mean, much more so than usual. And just all of these elements come together to form this outstanding piece of literature. This is, for me, as a top 10 Christie short story and the best of Mr. Quinn and Satterthwaite, so it takes the crown at number 1. And that is it for this video. Let me know what you think about Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite. It had been a very long time since I read any of these stories, and I still enjoyed them as much as I remembered. And we still have a lot of Christie short story collections left. There's Parker Pyne, who, again, not a big fan of Parker Pyne. And we have some, like, Poirot's early cases, and there's also, like, a scattering of other short stories. I didn't necessarily cover these in the best way because I went by collection, and then starting to get into these short stories that like appear in multiple collections, so it's getting a bit awkward. I'll figure out the best way to handle those. But next week I have my first review video for an Harley Quin novel, Cat of Many Tales. Very appropriate in this ongoing heat wave we're experiencing, at least where I am. And I know a lot of you have not read a lot of Harley Quin, or many may not have read Harley Quin at all. And while Cat of Many Tales is not like the typical Harley Quin story, this is absolutely worth reading. I think it's one of the best written mysteries of all time. It is not a traditional mystery or a typical Queen novel. It's a serial killer novel, or more accurately, a multiple murderer novel, as they were referred to. And it's celebrating its 75th anniversary this year, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.